Welcome to chapter 13. This chapter is on meaning and values. So our quest for meaning involves asking three key existential questions, none of which have really easy or absolute answers. But those questions are, who am I, where am I going, and why? So it's about kind of examining your identity, your goals, and your purpose or meaning in life. So in this chapter, we are going to try to understand what is involved in the search for meaning. We're going to try to examine the foundations of meaning. We're going to provide a framework for understanding religion and spirituality. We're going to examine the meaning of embracing diversity. We also want to come to a deeper appreciation of the value of diversity. We want to become aware of our prejudices and try to challenge them. And we also want to get a better understanding of how counseling can be a resource for change and not just something that people do when they're mentally ill, but something that can be a tool for anyone who's interested in achieving self-actualization or working on their own personal growth and development. Okay, so let's begin by talking about that first existential question, who am I? So on our quest for our identity, the first thing to keep in mind is that an identity is not achieved like once and for all. It's not like you're going to really get to a point where you're like done, where you got everything completely figured out, unless maybe you do become self-actualized, but that's generally a pretty long journey. So it's not necessarily about choosing certain beliefs and then holding on to them forever. So you don't have to, in order to have like a clear sense of identity, you don't have to be like, I'm a Republican and then stay a Republican forever, or I'm against guns, or Bigfoot exists, and like you can never change your mind. We all change our minds as we gain experience. So those things are bound to happen. Achieving your identity is more about trusting yourself. So listening to your inner selves and being able to trust what you hear. And so being aware when your mind changes on something, or you've had an experience that's kind of caused you to reflect on something in a new way, to pay attention to those moments and to listen to yourself and to trust yourself. So identifying your core values is a part of this quest, though. So your values are core beliefs that influence how you act. So when you're asking, who am I, what are the things that are kind of intangible? What are the things that you're really not going to necessarily change your mind on? Maybe things like be honest, be kind, be empathetic, be generous. So in doing this, kind of identifying our core values, we may decide to go against our cultural upbringings to create an identity that's more congruent with our own personal values. So for example, if you're raised in a culture that believes women are inferior to men, you may not hold that as a core value, and therefore you might not treat women as though they're inferior to men, because maybe you were raised in a different culture, or it just doesn't sit right with you, or whatever. So now we're going to watch a video on this first existential question, who am I, that kind of breaks down everything we were just talking about.
Over a lifetime, all of us change to an extraordinary degree. From a physical perspective, we start off as a little bundle about 50 centimeters high with cherubic features and elastic soft skin, and then we may end up, some 90 years later, as a stooped, grey, liver-spotted, 180 centimeter high structure. In the intervening period, every single cell in our body will have been replaced, often many times over, and will have gone through all kinds of experiences that perhaps leave almost no trace in memory. The 25-year-old won't remember most of what the 5-year-old felt so strongly about. The 67-year-old will only dimly recall what was on their mind as they approached 30. We carry the same name throughout our lives and consider ourselves as a relatively stable, unitary entity. But is it really right to think of ourselves as the same person? Once one puts it under a philosophical microscope, the issue of personal identity emerges as far trickier than at first assumed. So in what ways could we be said to be continuous throughout time? What does guarantee that we can plausibly think of ourselves as the same people over a lifetime? just where is personal identity located? A standard assumption is that it's our body that guarantees our personal identity. This is the theory that a key part of what makes me me is that I'm housed in an identical body. But philosophers like to push this assumption around a little. Imagine if I lost all my hair. Would I still be me? Yes, sure. What if I lost a finger? Yes. A leg? Definitely. Now, what if a malevolent demon appeared and told us that we'd have to lose every part of our bodies, but could keep just one bit? Which bit would it be? Few of us would pick our elbow or belly button. Almost all of us would pick our brains. Now that tells us something interesting. We assume implicitly that some bits of our bodies are more me-ish, closer to the core of personal identity than others. And the most me-ish of all the bits are our brains. Christianity runs a version of this thought experiment. It asks us to think what will happen after our death, and it imagines a separation of the body, ultimately not that significant, and the ongoing survival of a more modest, precious bit that it calls the soul. There's another version of this thought experiment that two lovers can play. In the early throes of love, two people who've gone to bed together might ask, "What do you really like about me?" The wrong answer is to say, "Your fabulous breasts," or "your amazing muscular arms." Breasts and chest don't ultimately feel me-ish enough to be a respectable answer. It seems we want to be loved for something closer to our real self, perhaps our soul or our brain. Now let's push the thought experiment further. What bit of the brain is actually most crucial to being me? Let's imagine that I have a bump to the head and lose my ability to play table tennis. Am I still myself? Most of us would say, yes, sure. What if I once spoke Latin and lose the ability, or forgot how to cook asparagus with a light mayonnaise sauce? Would I still be me? Yes. In other words, technical capacities don't feel very close to the core of personal identity. What about other kinds of memories? A big part of making me me tends to be my store of memories. I remember the carpet in my bedroom when I was growing up, or the girl I was in love with at university, or the weather over Sydney as we came into land for my first Australian book tour. But what if these memories all vanished as well? Could I still be me? One view is possibly, so long as something else remained, and that thing we can call my character. In other words, if my characteristic way of responding to situations, my sense of what is funny, wise, interesting, or important remain the same, I can still, in some fundamental way, claim to be the same person. My memory store of feelings and behaviors might be gone, but I could be assured of continuing to feel and behave in compatible ways in the future. Those around me would need to keep reminding me of stuff that had happened, but they would still recognize me as me. A fascinating idea comes into view. Personal identity seems to consist not in bodily survival. I could be put in somebody else's body or live in a jar and still be me, nor in the survival of memory. I could forget everything and still be me, but in the survival of what we're here going to call character. This is an idea attributed to the English philosopher John Locke, who famously wrote that personal identity is made up of what he called sameness of consciousness. If a demon offered us a choice between remembering everything but feeling and valuing very differently, or feeling and valuing the same sorts of things but remembering nothing, most of us would, Locke suggests, choose the latter. So, if we have to boil personal identity down to its essence, it seems to come down to values, inclinations, and temperament. Let's think of death with all this in mind. The standard view of death is that it's sad because it means the end of our identity. Now, it certainly does mean the end if we identify identity with the survival of our bodies or with that of our memories. But if we think that who we are is to a large degree about our values and characteristic loves and hates, then we are, in a sense, granted a kind of immortality, simply through the fact that these will continue to live on in our species as a whole, lodged here and there outside of their present home. Perhaps what we have learnt to call me was only ever a temporary resting place for a set of ideas and proclivities that are far older and are destined to live on far longer than our bodies. We might attempt to be less sad about death by letting go of the idea that we are a particular constellation of physical features. We are always, in a sense, far longer lasting, far more transgenerational as a bundle of inclinations and ideas. We will continue to crop up and live wherever those ideas that are most characteristic of us will emerge, as they must, in the generations that are to come. Focusing in on questions of identity has the paradoxical and rather cheering effect of making us both less attached to certain bits of us and more confident that the really important things about who we have been will survive, in a way, long after our bodies have returned to dust and our memories have been obliterated.
All right, so for lecture activity 1 for chapter 13, I would like for you to make a list of 3 to 5 of your core values, what you would consider to be values that you really think you're going to probably stick with for your entire life, values that you feel like are not something you'd compromise on. So give me a list of 3 to 5 of what you think are your core values. Okay, so let's talk about the remaining 2 existential questions. Where am I going and why? And so these relate to our search for meaning and purpose. And the first thing to kind of point out is that there is this phenomenon known as the crisis of meaninglessness. And the crisis of meaninglessness addresses the question, how do we find meaning in a universe that has no meaning, right? Everything can kind of seem random at times or chaotic. And then other times people have phrases like everything happens for a reason, So we generally, as people do, experience those moments where everything kind of seems meaningless. So in those moments, what we need to do is create our own meaning. And some people argue that creating our own meaning is precisely our challenge as human beings. That meaning is found in both self-awareness and relationships with other people. And the important thing is to try to find a balance between giving to others and those relationships and also sacrificing ourselves. So it's a give and take. We need to be generous. We need to be self-sacrificing. But we also don't want to be overly giving or self-sacrificing to the point that we're harming ourselves or denying ourselves of things that we need for our own personal growth and development. So it's really a balance between the two. We know that meaning in life has widespread benefits for our well-being. In fact, research shows that when people feel their lives have no meaning, they're actually more likely to become suicidal. So finding meaning in your life and having meaning enhances your physical health, your happiness, and reduces depression and anxiety. Both nostalgia and hope are related to meaning in life. It's important to live in the moment, but it's also important to have ideals, to have dreams, and to have goals. And additionally, we can learn from our past. So while we want to try to live in the moment as much as possible, from time to time, it might be good to kind of reflect on our past when we need a reminder of how to behave in a certain situation, or we need to kind of remember a life lesson that we learned if we're re-experiencing a similar situation. And it's also important to kind of have an idea of how you want your future to look so that you have something to look forward to. And we need to formulate and reform our own philosophy of life, and we probably will have to do that several times throughout our lives. So a philosophy of life is made up of our fundamental beliefs, attitudes, and values that govern our behavior. And so to develop your philosophy of life, you'll want to create time to be alone in reflective thought, and this is maybe where you do look back on those life lessons or think about your dreams and goals. You'll want to reflect on your basic assumptions about life. What are your basic assumptions about people, relationships, God, religion, politics, things like that, kind of the big questions. You also want to consider what meaning your eventual death has for the way you're currently living. So, knowing that death is part of the life cycle, how does that impact your day to day? We also want to listen to others who challenge our beliefs. We don't necessarily have to agree with them or just automatically disagree with them, but we want to listen to what they have to say and at least give it consideration. And then finally, another way to help us develop our philosophy of life is to adopt an accepting attitude toward those whose belief system is different from yours. So we don't have to adopt their exact attitude or their exact beliefs, but we can adopt the idea that they have different beliefs than us, and that that's okay, and that they're allowed to have those beliefs, and we can accept that about other people. There's lots of people who live with the passion and purpose that we're kind of talking about in this chapter, and hopefully that we're striving for. So some examples of people who exemplify living with passion and purpose are people like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi or Viktor Frankl. But the history of the human experience is full of stories of people who strive for a meaningful existence through their devotion to a particular cause. For example, Martin Luther King, his purpose was to fight for equality for all people, regardless of how much resistance he encountered. And it is said that he did more for the progress of racial equality in 13 years than had been done in the previous 350 years. Another person who lives with passion and purpose was Viktor Frankl, and he believed that our search for purpose is really what distinguishes us as humans. He invented a type of therapy called logotherapy, and this type of therapy actually focuses on exactly what we're talking about here. It's therapy through meaning or healing through meaning, so finding meaning in your life. And what's interesting about Viktor Frankl is he actually survived the Nazi concentration camps and found that other survivors were the ones that had hope. So people that had a sense of purpose and a sense of passion kind of birthed this feeling of hope. And those people, he observed, were the ones that would live through the very harsh circumstances. And Frankl said at some point that he kind of built his philosophy off of something Nietzsche said. And so he quoted Nietzsche, who said that he who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how. In other words, if you have purpose, you can kind of cope and make it through almost any situation. So what these men have taught us, amongst a bunch of other women and historical figures, is that the decisions we make or fail to make will ultimately shape the meaning of our lives. Okay, for lecture activity 2, I would like for you to imagine that you had all the money and all the time in the world necessary to devote yourself to a particular cause. And so under those ideal conditions, what cause would you dedicate your life to promoting and defending and fighting for in the way that Martin Luther King Jr. did, for example? So give me a, I don't know, like 2 to 3 sentences on what your cause would be and why you would devote yourself to that cause for lecture activity 2. So at times we may question, like, am I a good person? Am I a bad person? And most of us decide that we are good people, right? But even good people are capable of doing bad things. And one of the most famous psychological studies that demonstrated this was done by a psychologist named Philip Zimbardo. And the study that he conducted was called the Stanford Prison Experiment. There's been tons of movies made based on the experiment. It's very, very famous. And just briefly, what he did was he asked Stanford male students to sign up to participate in an experiment, and then he randomly chose half of them to be prisoners and half of them to be prison guards. And then he converted the basement of Stanford into this makeshift prison. And he gave the prisoners clothing and items that you would typically see on a prisoner. So, like a smock and chains and numbers instead of names that they would wear on their prison outfits. And then the prison guards were given, prison guard uniforms and mirrored glasses and a baton and things of that nature. And so the idea was that Zimbardo was just going to kind of sit back and watch and see if you take just people at random that are seemingly normal people and you put them under certain conditions and give them certain titles and roles, how will they behave? And what he found is that people really, really adopted these roles, and it got crazy. It got so crazy that he had to actually end the experiment early because the prison guards were becoming verbally, emotionally, and even at times physically abusive towards the prisoners, and the prisoners were really suffering psychologically. And so what he deduced from this was that our behavior is in large due to the environment in which we exist. And so when we're looking at ourselves and asking, am I bad or am I good? The truth is, maybe there's no such thing as bad and good, or maybe there is, I don't know, but we're all maybe a combination where we're all capable of kind of doing things that we might not think we are capable of doing. It just depends on the circumstance or on the environment. So those are things to just keep in mind. But what Zimbardo says is that in addition to our genes, our personality, and our character, we do need to consider two potential critical catalysts for behavior change: the external situation and the system that creates and maintains that situation. So when you're looking at yourself for self-awareness, you need to think about your environment and the systems that you're in and how they're facilitating your personal growth or not facilitating it, hindering it. Zimbardo's current passion is what's called the Heroic Imagination Project, and its mission is to teach people skills and knowledge needed to make effective decisions in challenging situations. So one of the goals is to teach people how to avoid the natural tendency to wait and watch in situations where people actually need help. And so sometimes this is referred to as the bystander effect, where if someone is in need of help and there's a bunch of people around, we're less likely to actually get in and help. So this project works with at-risk students to kind of change that instinct. And the belief is that the antidote to evil or being bad is being a hero. And so he says that in order for an act to be considered heroic, it has to meet 4 criteria. And the first is that the act is engaged in voluntarily. The second criteria of a heroic act is that it provides a service to one or more people in need or the whole community. The third criteria is that it involves a potential risk or cost to your physical comfort, your social status, or your quality of life. And then finally, it is initiated without the expectation of material gain. So in other words, you're doing it completely altruistically. In a speech to Stanford graduates, Oprah said, "To have meaning in life, you must choose love, and let every step you take lead you in the direction of that love." So spirituality and religion provides many people with this sense of meaning. So in this class, we do talk about religion and spirituality. And so it's important to kind of understand why in a psychology class, which, as psychologists, we try to be very scientific minded, why we would talk about these ideas. And there's a lot of research that shows the benefits of spirituality and religion on a person's physical and mental health. But I also think it's interesting to investigate the interaction between spirituality and psychology. So we're going to watch a quick video clip that looks at that relationship.
See, human being is quite complex. We have a soul that longs for God, but we also have a personality, an ego, and that has developed, that has conditioning, influence of parents, and all of the dramas of being alive, being part of humanity. And when you really seriously commit yourself to spiritual life, you have to start to clear out some of the clutter you have accumulated in your life. And for this, it is necessary to have some psychological system. Otherwise, what happens is the bright light of the divine in you floods you and you get unbalanced. You have to become grounded in yourself. Sadly, there have been people who have become intoxicated with God, but then unbalanced, because they haven't done the inner work that is needed for grounding the human being. But you need a process to help you to prepare, help the inner self to prepare. And for this, psychological work I have found to be essential. For example, work on the shadow, the darkness within ourselves, one's anger, one's jealousy, those feelings that come up unexpectedly. They can, if you don't work on them, they can subvert the whole spiritual process. And when my teacher, Irina Tweedy, went to India to study with a great Sufi master, she found that his process of spiritual training was similar in many ways to the Jungian process of individuation. She said, she went there, she said, I hoped for instructions in yoga. I expected wonderful teachings. But what the teacher did was force me to face the darkness within myself, and it almost killed me. Because that is the groundwork for spiritual life. If you haven't done that inner work, if you haven't explored yourself psychologically, then the spiritual energies that come into the human being will unbalance you. You'll become ungrounded. But what is important is to work with a psychological framework that is not focused on the ego, that is really focused on the relationship between the ego and the self. And that is why in our particular tradition we've used the Jungian model of psychology, because Jung was at heart a Gnostic or a mystic, and his psychology has a deep spiritual foundation and respect for the divine, for the self that is in the core of our being.
So spirituality is a set of beliefs and practices that can result in a life-changing path that gives greater meaning, purpose, and fulfillment to a person's life. So spirituality is often viewed as a journey, an odyssey, a quest, a pilgrimage, a process, a wandering or a movement, an expedition into the meaning of life. And spirituality can help us to be more in control of our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. The Dalai Lama believes that the ultimate goal of all religions is to produce better human beings who will demonstrate caring and acceptance of others. And he argues that it is important to accept the diversity of all religions and appreciate the value of them. He says that religion should be used to reduce conflict and suffering, not to divide us. He also believes that religion should provide hope for people in tough times, and that it should be a way of connecting people so that we can support one another. He says that the various sacred texts, for example, the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, they all share similar messages, and one of the main messages is a message of hope. He says that all religions have these same basic spiritual values, and the basic spiritual values, according to the Dalai Lama, are qualities such as goodness, kindness, love, compassion, tolerance, forgiveness, warmth, and caring. But of all these spiritual values, he argues that the one that may be the most important is compassion. So compassion is caring about another's suffering and doing something about it. And it's also important to have compassion for yourself, to be able to forgive yourself for things that you consider to be mistakes, to let those things go, to look at them as a part of the process, as a part of learning and growing that we all must go through as human beings, and to be kind to yourself and watch how you speak to yourself. Speak to yourself with empathy, live in the moment, recognize where you're having a tough time, pay attention to that, and be compassionate towards yourself in those moments. So of all of these basic spiritual values, possibly the most important is compassion towards others and yourself. Alright, so let's watch a video on the scientific benefits of spirituality and religion.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to TestTube Plus today. This is episode 4 of 5 on our series about God and religion, but mainly God. I hope you enjoyed the series so far. If you haven't seen it, make sure you subscribe and go back and watch all of those episodes. But by now, we've talked a lot about where God came from, where scientists believe in God, and where they decide they don't believe in God, and even where the concept of God came from. But now we're going to ask a question: do we benefit from having God around? Is God helpful? There are studies that show that people benefit from having belief, that church is actually a good thing. It's good for you. We might benefit from having a belief system in general. People who reported going to church at least 3 times a month had blood pressure that was on average 1 to 2 points lower than those who didn't go to church. Thinking about God calms people down if they are religious. And a study published in the Journal for the Association of Psychological Science showed that brain activity decreases in areas related to regulating arousal and alerting us when things are wrong while we were thinking about God. Religious parents are found to have better behaved and more social children. A study found that churchgoers live 2.1 to 3.7 years longer than non-churchgoers, and another study even touted an extra 7 years of life expectancy for the faithful. One study showed that Christians seem to be happier on social media versus atheists on social media. But believing in God clearly has some positive effects. So if you believe in multiple gods, does that mean you get more benefit? You multiplying your benefits because there are more gods around? That's not really been studied in the same way, but a cool 2007 LA Times article by Mary Lefkowitz made a really great observation. In a monotheistic religion, God is always good, provides judgment, and is just. Believers take the blame for things that go wrong. But polytheistic religions, different gods, do battle amongst themselves. Some create evil in the world, some are good. Believers of polytheistic religions might be less stressed when bad things happen because they can shift the justification off of themselves. Oh, that's just this evil god doing this thing, you know? There are polytheists of, like, the Norse religion who have the god Loki, the god of mischief, and it would make sense to be like, oh, this bad thing happened. You know what? That must be Loki. He's being crazy. And then a good thing happened. Oh, you know, that must be this God that does good stuff. You know, it's a way to spread the blame around. But again, not scientific study, just a cool observation. I think the real question here that we're trying to get to in this whole series is almost in one packet right here. Are atheists happier than theists, or vice versa? A study showed that was in the UK most significantly, that spiritual people were nearly 3 times more likely to experience an episode of depression than secular people. Let me say that again just to make sure. Spiritual people were nearly 3 times more likely to experience an episode of depression than secular people. But again, religion can certainly help people be happier, but other people can also help you be happier. Other things help you do the same thing. A peaceful, cooperative society, even in the absence of religion, has the same effect as a religious society. Most of the time when we study religion, what we're actually studying is social structure. We're studying this community of people who have something to share. When I was young, I went to church from time to time. I was exposed to religion, but I wasn't told that I must be part of that. My parents weren't particularly religious, so I didn't have to be part of a religion if I didn't want to, but I still went to church. And I was also part of the Boy Scouts. I'm an Eagle Scout, and that requires a religious component. You cannot become an Eagle Scout without a sign-off from a religious person or a religious group. I have nothing but praise to heap on scouting and what it taught me over the years, including the tolerance for different religions, because you're exposed to so many different kinds of people, especially at bigger and bigger and bigger levels. But as a person who was less religious than some of the faithful around me, I still saw benefits from being in these communities, because what you're really talking about is social groups. You're talking about this social group that's part of this social group that's part of this social group. And we share values, and we can all talk about it. We can all feel good about it. Some people get really amazing value and pride from their faith, and some people draw pride and value from elsewhere. Both are significant, both are important, and you know what? Both are personal.
All right, so we've talked about core values, and we've talked about this basic spiritual values, but now let's look deeper at values and really look at how we can take our values and move them into action. And so the first step in doing this is kind of asking yourself, where did I develop my values? Sometimes we just adopt our parents' values or other important people in our lives, but we don't really think about if we actually agree with them. We just go with them because that's what our parents told us they do. Another question to ask is, have I questioned my values? It's important that we assess our values at various points in our lives to make sure that they're still appropriate. Values that we had as a kid might not really be appropriate as an adult or useful. Another value question that you can ask is, are my values and practices open to modification? If we find that our values are no longer appropriate, then we need to be open to change and have a growth mindset. So another good question to ask is, do I find consistency between what I say I believe in and what I actually do? So our daily activities, behavior, speech, they're all expressions of our values. And if there's an incongruency between what we say and what we do, then we really need to re-examine our behavior or our values or both. The next question you should ask yourself is, am I willing to accept people who hold different values than me? Our values do affect our relationships, and it's important that we understand that we can't try to convert people with different values to just adopt our values. And then the last question is, do I avoid judging others even if they think, feel, or act in different ways from me? So it isn't appropriate for us to expect others to have the same values as us. We all come from different situations and have different perspectives on life. So we need to be able to express ourselves, and we also need to be able to listen to others without judgment. It doesn't mean we agree with them, but it means that we're willing to have an open mind and hear out other people, and maybe we can learn something from them, whether it's something positive or not. Okay, so it's important to embrace diversity. Like we were talking about, we don't all see the world from the same perspective, and so it's important to learn from one another and try to keep an open mind to the alternative points of view. And meaning in life can be found by paying attention to the common ground that we all share, and by becoming aware of the universal themes that unite us, such as, heartbreak, joy, happiness, the love of family, things like that. Some people feel threatened by people who are different from them, but we can all learn a lot from each other. So some people think that culture is just about race or ethnicity, but it's about a lot more than that. There's all kinds of different cultures and subcultures, like the LGBTQ community, people with disabilities, people of different religions. And so culture is defined as the knowledge, language, values, and customs that are passed from person to person and from one generation to the next generation. There is something that we want to avoid, which is called ethnocentric bias, and this is using our own culture or country as a standard of what is right and good, and judging other cultures or countries from our own frame of reference. So this can lead us to live in what we call an encapsulated world, which is something that we also want to try to avoid. And this is seeking support from others who think and value as we do, and having negative attitudes towards those who are different from us. So we want to avoid ethnocentric bias and encapsulated world, and instead we want to create a philosophy of life that embraces understanding and acceptance of diverse worldviews. So diversity is defined as understanding and appreciating differences among people based upon such variables as age, gender, culture, disability, education level, residential locations, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, language, sexual orientation, and spiritual and religious beliefs. So it's really possible to kind of create a philosophy of life that embraces diversity if you are a person that has a lot of prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice and discrimination are paths towards an ever-narrowing existence. Discrimination is biased behavior toward a particular group of people, and a stereotype is a judgmental generalization applied to an individual without regard to his or her own uniqueness. So people use stereotypes because they're intellectually lazy. It's easier to just sum up a group of people as being one thing than to have to look at them as individuals, right? And then it's easier to just kind of put everyone into these certain boxes, and then that way, if a behavior happens, you can go, oh yeah, well that's because this person is in that box, and you always have a simple explanation for their behavior. But those explanations aren't necessarily true. So becoming aware of our own subtle prejudice is the first step towards change. And prejudice is a preconceived notion or opinion about someone or some group of people. So people can have prejudice against all kinds of subgroups, against genders, ethnicities, etc. Not everyone voices their prejudice, but it does affect the way that they interact with others, whether they're aware of it or not. In fact, a lot of prejudice is subtle or even unconscious, so it's important that we really take a hard look at our prejudices and examine them. There are different types of prejudice behavior. For example, unintentional racism is assuming that one is free of any traces of prejudicial attitudes or racism. So thinking that you are not racist at all may actually cause you to say or do insensitive or ignorant things because we lack the self-awareness. There is also a term that has gained a lot of popularity recently called microaggressions, and these are persistent verbal, behavioral, and environmental assaults, insults, and invalidations that may be subtle and are really difficult to identify. For example, just saying to like a boy, oh, you run like a girl, or saying to someone who's has English as their second language, you speak English well. You might think that you are complimenting this person, but in actuality, you're pointing out that they are different from you, or that while they speak English well, it's unexpected because they are not from this culture, and therefore, again, just pointing out how different they are. And then the last term is white privilege. And so white privilege is defined as unearned advantages and benefits of white people that give them an advantage over people of color. And it's common for white people to not recognize this privilege or to become defensive about it. There's a lot of people that argue that it's not a real thing, and they get kind of angry when people discuss white privilege. So the book provides 46 examples of white privilege, some of which include not worrying that you're being pulled over because of your race. White people are allowed to be concerned about race issues without being seen as self-seeking. White people have the privilege of being in the company of people in their race most of the time. And like I said, there's a total of 46 different examples of what is considered white privilege. And so the book's really arguing that we just need to kind of be aware of that and take that into consideration if we're going to be able to effectively address any prejudices or discriminations that we have, and also become more self-aware. So let's watch a quick video clip on the science of racism.
Given the racialized violence we have seen in our country, it is clear the civil rights movement is far from over and America is still plagued with racist ideology. But what can science say about race? What if science could help erase racism once and for all? Hey everyone, it's Natalia Reagan back at it again at D News. First of all, it is time that we start teaching our kids as soon as they can talk, and adults for that matter, that there is no biological basis for racial classification. In terms of biology, race doesn't exist. Now that's not to say race isn't real, though it's important to understand that race is a cultural construct, that humans created this and it has nothing to do with our biology. There are no distinct genetic boundaries for the groups commonly called races. Traditionally, scientists have used race to refer to a subspecies, and what determines a subspecies from a species varies among taxa. But in humans, there are no distinct genetic boundaries for the groups commonly called races, and we only have 0.1% variation within our own species versus chimpanzees, which have from 0.3 to 0.7% variation. Now, there is genetic variation within and between populations, but it is quite small. And the most amount of genetic variation found within our species isn't between those of European and African ancestry, it's between various populations within Africa. This is called the founder effect, or reduced genetic diversity in a population founded by a small small number of individuals. Now, scientists refer to races as populations or ethnic groups, and many of the physical characteristics that are associated with race are due to adaptations to climate and environment. This can include skin color, height, nose shape. These slight morphological differences are called clines. They are genetic adaptations to the environment over time in a geographic area. As biological anthropologist Todd Disotell would say, it's about clines, not clades, meaning the variations between populations of our species are rather small versus being another branch in the old evolutionary family tree. There's also the idea that certain races are more susceptible to certain illnesses, such as heart disease and diabetes in African Americans. However, extensive research has shown that these illnesses are highly correlated with diet, stress, and socioeconomic standing. Thus, it's a lot more complex than just saying certain races are more likely to suffer from certain illnesses than others. Okay, so we've established that race as a scientific concept does not exist. So if race doesn't really exist, then why are people racist? Are we born to be wary of the other, or is this a learned behavior? Biological anthropologist Robert Sussman tackles the history of racism and the concept of race in his book, The Myth of Race. He stresses that racism is a learned behavior or ideology that can be avoided if parents teach their children to be open and tolerant. Sussman also discusses the history of racism, stating that the concept of human races began in the Spanish Inquisition around 1480. When the purity of blood decree was established, those converting to Christianity needed to prove their Christian origins. Well, searching for pure blood is a ridiculous idea, considering that there has been no point in time when any population could be considered pure. This ideology, rooted in a racist political and religious agenda, continued on and was used by the Nazis to justify their goal to create an Aryan race, which led them to murder 6 million Jews and millions of others who they deemed inferior, including gypsies, homosexuals, and transgender individuals. But what if the Nazi agenda worked? Sure, we might all be speaking German, but we'd also have a population of people who might be considered pure in terms of lower genetic diversity. But low genetic diversity is usually the result of long-term inbreeding. So we'd have a population of inbreds that would also inherit a slew of genetic ailments associated with inbreeding. Yeah, so how's that for your not so fabulous result of genetic purity? And guess what? Genetic diversity is actually good for us. It leads to robust and healthy offspring. And who doesn't want that? Scientifically speaking, there's only one race, the human race. We're all pretty much the same. And if you want to know more about what science says about race, ethnicity, evolution, check out Trace's series on TestTube Plus.
We also found new climates in Europe. Africa is a very different climate than Europe. Europe is a little colder, the weather is a lot different. And because of that, we had to adapt.
It's a great discussion on his new show, so I really recommend that you check it out. It's the first link in the description if you're on a mobile. Got any burning questions you want to ask us or other science topics you want us to cover? Leave them in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more D News every day of the week.
Here are some of the different ways that we can break down the barriers that separate us. The first thing that we can do is acknowledge and understand your biases and prejudices. Everyone has biases and everyone has prejudices, and it's important to identify them, consider them, break them down, think about them, and try to gain better understanding of how you develop them, the validity of them, and of course how to kind of get rid of them or work around them. It's important to critically examine your prejudices. So find out if they are true or not. Find out if it's fair to judge someone based on these pre-existing beliefs that you have that might not be true for that particular person. And the next thing that we can do to break down the barriers between us is to be respectful of those who differ from us. So just because someone is different doesn't mean that they are deficient or inferior or any less than us. And so this requires shedding our ego a little bit and being aware that there's room for everyone, and that we don't need to have people be just like us in order for us to understand them or enjoy their company or be compassionate and loving towards them. Another thing that we can do is learn about cultures that differ from our own. Different cultures are really interesting, and they have a lot of interesting history and rituals and beliefs, and they also have things that are in common with your particular culture. There's a lot of crossover, so it's interesting to find the similarities and differences between cultures, and it also allows us to understand behavior of other people a lot better. And then we also want to be willing to test, adapt, and change our perceptions. So it's not a sign of weakness to change your mind. Actually, that is something that intellectuals do all the time. When we gain more information, it would be irresponsible to not change our mind if that new information doesn't match our old information. And then another thing that we can do that's actually a pretty cool exercise is to imagine what it would be like to be someone of the other sex. What would it be like to be a transgender person? What would it be like to be a person of a different sexual orientation? If you're a man, what would it be like to be a female? And kind of try to put yourself in those shoes and think about the issues that those people face on a daily basis. And that is another way that we can kind of increase our empathy and compassion for one another and break down those barriers that cause us to look at each other as different rather than really being incredibly similar, which is true of human beings, is that we are incredibly similar to one another. Okay, so we have talked today about finding meaning and purpose, and along with finding meaning and purpose can go hand in hand with making a difference, right? We might find meaning and purpose in making a difference in our lives and the lives of others in certain causes. However, making a difference can seem like an overwhelming task, especially when you think about some of the historical figures we've discussed today, like MLK Jr. or Viktor Frankl. But you don't have to be the next MLK Jr. You can just start with yourself and be the best you that you can be. Part of that means don't blame external forces for outcomes that you're unhappy with, right? So when things go wrong in your life or you have a failure, instead of, looking for a situation or a person to blame, look at yourself and see what you could have done differently. This way you have control over the situation and you can change in a way to better your life so that this outcome doesn't occur again. If, something bad happens and you go, oh, there's nothing I can do about it, well, then you're completely giving up control and there's no way that you can prevent that from happening again in the future, right? So as painful as it might be to our ego, when we make a mistake, we need to own it and we need to learn from it so that we can be the best version of ourselves. So there are really 3 things that we can do to make a difference. There's lots of things we can do, but 3 kind of broad categories. So through our attitudes, choices, and actions, we all have the capacity to make a difference in the world. We can start just by helping other people. Help out a family member, a friend, or a certain neighborhood that's maybe in need. Another thing that we can do is get involved. Get involved in human rights organizations, support social justice programs. And then the third thing we can do is take steps to protect our planet. So some of the steps that we can take include recognizing that we are indeed in the midst of a growing global crisis. There's a problem, and the majority of that problem is due to humans. And so just as we talked about not blaming external forces for our own personal failures or mistakes, we need to do the same when it comes to protecting our planet. So we are responsible for the current conditions of the planet, and we can do things to slow the process and potentially even rectify it. So the next step is to recognize that each of us can and must assume personal responsibility to bring out changes. And then also, it's important to note that sometimes even the smallest changes have a surprisingly consequential effect on saving the planet. And so you see here in the video, it's a bunch of different ways that you can go green or improve the quality of the environment. And so to kind of find the motivation to do these things, it's important to think about, like, what kind of world do you want to leave to the next generation? And so hopefully, the answer is that you want to leave a world that is in good quality and in good shape and livable conditions. And then there are things that we can do to help make that a possibility. All right, for lecture activity 3, I'd like for you to think of just one person that you could help. So think of one person in your life that you could help. You can name them if you want, or you can leave them unnamed and just describe them as an aunt, a relative, a neighbor, a friend, something like that. and then describe in what ways they need help and what ways you could help them out. So do this in 3 to 4 sentences. Tell me who you'd help, why you chose that person, and how you would help them for lecture activity 3. We had talked about the idea that if you want to make a difference, one of the things that you can do is work on being the best version of yourself. And you can find meaning through this personal growth. So here we're going to talk about some pathways for self-exploration, for personal growth, for self-awareness. So if you've been reflecting on yourself over the course of the semester, then you've already started the process. And personal growth is a process. It's not a destination. So you can think of it as kind of a lifelong journey. And you can deliberately choose experiences that will help you become the person you want to be. You can begin by taking small steps towards certain goals in your life. You can do things like meditate, get involved in charity, seek counseling, journaling, hobbies you've wanted to do, whether that be learning the guitar or gardening. And you might consider seeking counseling if you feel out of control of your life, if you feel stuck, like you don't have any kind of momentum going, if you are involved in an unsatisfying relationship, if you are experiencing a spiritual crisis, if you are experiencing a significant loss, if you are the victim of discrimination or oppression, if you fear using your potential because you're afraid of failure, or if you just want to kind of gain some self-awareness and be the best version of yourself that you can be. And only you can really change your ways of thinking, your feeling, and behaving. And change is tough. Even seemingly simple things like changing ways of thinking is tough, but you can certainly do it. But we have to understand that the challenge is 100% on us. And we are responsible for the changes in our life. So we can't expect family members, partners, or any external forces to change us. So it's important to keep in mind that during the process of change, letting go of old familiar ways of being is challenging. Moving out of your parents' house, leaving an unhealthy relationship, these things are comfortable, they're familiar, and it's difficult to make change. It's scary. However, letting go of thoughts, feelings, or actions that don't serve you or are unhealthy is a really important step to your own well-being and happiness. So I hope that you will continue your journey on personal growth and self-awareness so that you can have the best possible life and be the best possible version of yourself. Okay, that is it for Chapter 13. Be sure to submit your completed lecture activities and do the assignments associated with this chapter. Have a great day.